The second gospel that comes in the process of Mark is that we have Mark, who is written somewhere around 65. The other two gospels are most probably written round about the same time. The first one is Matthew. Now, Matthew is the only one of the synoptic gospels who was actually a disciple. But again, we need to give that reality that we don't know who wrote Matthew's gospel. Ought we know it was attributed to Matthew in the life of the church. And the life of the church, obviously the traditions grew up very quickly around these pieces of writing. And so the pieces of writing then immediately were ascribed to particular writers. Now, of course, sometimes the ascription to a writer is there not because they wrote it, but because they inspired it, or they maybe wrote the framework for it. Either way, we don't know. And so for the purposes of this course, we continue to say it was Mark and Matthew and Luke who actually wrote each of the books that are ascribed or attributed to them. So who was Matthew? Well, we potentially think that Matthew was Levi. He was one of the disciples. He was the one that Jesus called while he was a tax collector, or at least that's how it's most often translated. The truth is that he most probably wasn't a tax collector in the same way that Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Zacchaeus would have collected the personal tax, the income tax from the people. And that's what allowed him to be able to sometimes be a little bit, free in terms of his interpretation of how much people should pay. Matthew, on the other hand, most probably would be closer to what we would today call a toll booth operator. Someone who would sit on the main road possibly to the sea there in Galilee. And what he would do is he would sit in the booth and someone would come past with his cart and he would then tax a certain amount of whatever goods the person was going to go and sell to the dock. He would take a certain amount of that and give it to the Romans or the Roman overlord, or even possibly the Jewish overlord. We're not really sure who he was collecting taxes for. But either way, it would not have made him a popular figure. In fact, it's so wonderful to see the people that Jesus chose to be disciples. Because on one hand, you have Simon the Zealot, who would have been against these structures and institutions, both Roman and Jewish. But on the other side, you have Matthew, or Levi, who on that side of that says, no, he was actually aiding and abetting the locals. He was aiding and abetting the structure, whether again it be the Herodian structure or whether it be the Roman one. Either way, Matthew would have been an unclean person. He would have been one that would have been rejected, ostracized, outcast from his own community. And you can imagine that maybe to some degree there would have been a certain resentment involved with that. And some of that resentment you can find in the Gospel of Matthew. Because what you need to see is that the Gospel according to Matthew is a very Jewish Gospel. Why do we say that? Well, it's Jewish because it contains many, many allusions to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, or Tanakh as we've now come to understand it, is used many times without any connections, without any preambles, as if the people who would be reading it would actually know what the writer was talking about. That tells us two things. On one hand, it tells us that Matthew himself was quite well versed with Tanakh. On the other hand, it tells us also about the audience. It tells us that the audience most probably also knew Tanakh well. What's that led people to believe is that most probably the audience was in Judea, was a Jewish audience. Matthew is the most Jewish of all the writers. He brings up Jewish concepts, he brings up Jewish theology, he even brings up some of the discussions that the rabbis have had. So if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you see that there's a discussion about the issue of divorce. You can imagine that just as today, divorce was a very hot topic within the Judaistic framework, where people would have different beliefs about why or how someone could get divorced. He weighs into that and talks about the different rabbis when he talks about what Jesus was saying. And so you could see that it would be in an environment of people who would have known that those debates were happening. So most probably a Jewish audience. For a Jewish audience too, he begins with a genealogy of Jesus. And the interesting thing about the genealogy is the issue of the 14 generations each time. Now 14, of course, is a multiple of 7. And 7 being a Jewish perspective of God's complete number. The number of God's plan was the number 7. And so the fact that the genealogy constantly has this multiples of 7 tells you that each part of Jesus' genealogy was part of the plan of God. In the next clip, we'll look at the genealogy a bit closer to define some of what Matthew was trying to do in his gospel. So when was it written? We're not sure. Some people, again, would date it very early, into the early 50s. Others would date it much later. I date it somewhere around 75 AD. 75 AD. And the reason why I date it so late is because I believe that Matthew is written very much as a response to the destruction of the temple. That the temple is destroyed by Titus in 70 AD. And by 75 AD, it's given 5 years for the Jewish community, and especially the Jewish Christian community in Judea, to reflect on what that meant. On what does it mean now that the temple is destroyed? How now do we understand the concepts of Christianity? But more often, how do we understand now Christianity as the continuation and the natural continuation now that the temple is destroyed of Judaism? And I think that Matthew wants to offer some insight into that. I think Matthew wants to offer some connection into that, particularly in wanting to rattle the Jews a little bit about being the chosen people. So we can say then, in summary, that Matthew is most probably written to a Jewish audience, from a Jewish perspective. It's also written into a Jewish environment, most probably still Judea, where the Jews now have been scattered after the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. That where now the central focus of Christianity will now pass to the cities of the diaspora, places like Rome and Antioch and Constantinople, what would become Constantinople, and then later on into also in Alexandria in Egypt. That as those places now begin to take ascendancy over Jerusalem, Matthew is writing into the Jewish context saying, what do we now understand about ourselves as Jews in the light of what Jesus has been saying?